Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's greeted by scepticism, but we're going to interrupt that to bring you David Gauke, the Justice Secretary, live now in the Commons, giving a statement about the parole board and specifically the case of John Warboys. Let's listen in.
Challenge this decision in the courts and therefore to ask the court to stop the release of Warboys before the decision was reconsidered. Let me set out my approach to judicial review in general. Whatever one's personal feelings about a case, ministers should not choose to bring a legal challenge that has no reasonable prospect of success. But it is right that public bodies can be held to account for their actions through due process of law and, specifically, judicial review. There has been significant public debate about the possible basis for a legal challenge in a case such as this. It has been speculated that there are two grounds open to me to challenge such a decision. The decision was one that no board could reasonably have taken, or that there were significant procedural failings in the way that decision was taken. The bar for a judicial review to succeed is very high. The test for deciding if a decision is unreasonable is not simply that the decision maker, in this case the parole board, could have made an alternative decision, but that no reasonable person would have come to the same conclusion on the facts of the case. Similarly, on procedure, it would be necessary to identify a failing to follow that process by the parole board that would have had a material impact on the decision. Having taken considered and expert legal advice, I have decided that it would not be appropriate for me as Secretary of State to proceed with such a case. Honourable members will appreciate that I cannot go further and expose details of the legal advice I have been given. I know this will disappoint the victims in this case and members of this House. Given the crimes for which he has been convicted, on a personal level, candidly, I share those concerns. I have taken a close personal interest in this case since assuming office as the Secretary of State for Justice. I believe it is important that all of the victims have clarity as soon as possible, which is why I am before the House today. I can reassure the House and the public that Warboys will not be released until his licence conditions have been finalised. I understand that contact and meetings with victims who have chosen to receive the services of the Probation Victim Contact Scheme have taken place this week, and further meetings about his release will take place next week. This will have given those victims the opportunity to make representations to the parole board as to the conditions to which Warboys should be subject on release. Let me be absolutely clear, Warboys will not be released until their representations have been properly considered and his licence conditions are in place. Indeed, last week, I asked for assurances that the views of victims were being taken into account and that robust licensing conditions would be put in place to manage his risk. I am aware that some third parties have indicated they are seeking to bring legal proceedings themselves and that correspondence has been served on me as Secretary of State as a potential interested party to any litigation. I fully support the right of victims to take their own legal advice and to challenge the decision. The approach I am taking does not mean that others, who may have significant interest in the case, are precluded from taking action. Each case depends on the circumstances of each individual bringing a claim. And that is one of the reasons I do not intend to say more on this matter. I would not want to prejudice any legal challenges by commenting further on the facts of the particular case or the legal advice I have received. I will be taking advice on how my department should consequently engage in any proceedings, but it would not be appropriate to comment further at this stage. It is vitally important that the public and victims have confidence in the justice system that is there to serve them. And this case has exposed some issues with the parole process as a whole. I have already indicated that aspects of the parole process more generally should be examined. In my statement on the 9th of January, I said that my department would review the case for transparency in the process for parole decisions. how victims are communicated with, and how they are appropriately engaged in that process. I now believe that this review should go further. I have therefore expanded the terms of reference of the review to include consideration of the law, policy, guidance and practice relating to challenges to parole board decision-making. I have published these today and have placed a copy in the House Library. In particular, I have expanded the review to include whether there should be a mechanism to allow parole decisions to be reconsidered and how that might be best achieved whilst retaining the independence of the decision-making process. This review remains a priority for me and full government, and despite this significant expansion of the terms of reference, I intend to complete that review before Easter. I also acknowledge the concerns that the Victim Contact Scheme, operated by the National Probation Service, may not have worked as well as it should have in this particular case. It is right that, as well as looking at the process around parole decisions for all cases, that we consider whether existing processes were followed in this instance. I have therefore asked Dame Glenys Stacey, Majesty's Chief Inspector of Probation, to conduct a rapid fact-finding exercise to confirm whether the legislative provisions, existing policy and processes relating to victims were adequately followed by the National Probation Service in this case. Her findings will inform the wider review. Mr. Speaker, as I have said, I know members of the House are concerned about this case and about how we deal with the release of offenders. I hope this has reassured honourable members of the thorough and careful consideration I have made of this difficult case, and that we are now giving serious and urgent consideration to ways in which the process can be improved that reassures not only victims of these terrible crimes, but the wider public.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for prior sight of his statement. 2 weeks ago, it was announced that John Warboys would be released from prison. In those 2 weeks, it has been absolutely clear the victims of the vile crimes committed by John Warboys feel that our criminal justice system has let them down. Mr. Speaker, our criminal justice system must ensure that it has the victims of crime at its core. When it fails to do so, it affects not just the direct victims themselves, but risks undermining wider public trust in our justice system. As Labour has reiterated since the news of the release of John Warboys was announced, it is important that the Secretary of State does everything within his powers to ensure that the victims of Warboys' crimes, as well as the wider public, have faith in our justice system. So, Mr. Speaker, many will be disappointed by today's news. It is understood that legal advice can't be shared, and the Minister does not want to prejudice other cases being brought. But today's news makes the need for changes in the parole board even more pressing. The current rules permit either the Secretary of State or victims to bring judicial review. Many will have seen that they are doing, and that they have attracted much public support for their fundraising for this. Judicial review is a key tool for every citizen to be able to challenge unjust or unlawful decisions by the state or other public bodies. Deep cuts to legal aid have undermined the ability of many to pursue judicial review. And I would request that the government today, to using its legal aid review, to look again at how it can support judicial review. Any judicial review would look at whether the parole board's decision was taken properly. If not, then it would go back to the parole board to look at this again. But as it stands, the current rules mean we still wouldn't know the reasons for any subsequent parole board decision. As we, on this side of the House, both here and elsewhere, have repeatedly said, there is no need for the review announced into the parole board transparency to debate whether there is a case for greater transparency. It should be a practical review that looks at how to ensure the public is informed of the reasons behind parole board decisions. Just as the public is clear about the court's judgments, it needs to be able to be clear about the decisions of the parole board. Greater transparency has widespread support. So we welcome the widening of the review announced today, and especially a mechanism to allow parole board decisions to be reconsidered whilst retaining its independence. People were shocked that some of the victims found out about the decision of the release of Mr Warboys through the media. Labour has said from the outset that it is totally unacceptable and very concerning that someone not given the opportunity to participate in the parole board hearing, as is their right. The Victim Contact Scheme is responsible for informing victims of significant changes in the case, including parole board hearings. This service is managed by the National Probation Service, which has experienced significant difficulties, especially case overload, since the government's reforms to probation services in 2014. Labour had called in this House for the government to look into the failings in the MPS and Victim Contact Scheme. So it is a step forward that the Minister has now asked Dame Glenys Stacey to conduct a rapid fact-finding exercise into the role of the MPS. He needs to also ensure that this answers the questions being asked on whether his government's wholly negative changes to the probation service contributed to any failings in the case and how he plans to address them. Mr Speaker, listening to the statements of the victims of Mr Warboys in recent weeks, it is clear that their concerns are not limited to the decisions or indeed the functioning of the parole board. Labour has repeatedly stated that the Warboys case raises so many serious questions that anything less than an independent end-to-end review into the handling of the case, from the first report to the police of an attack right through to the parole board hearing, would let down the victims and the wider public. Mr Speaker, Labour has repeatedly called for this wider inquiry, but it is not clear why the Secretary of State for Justice has repeatedly refused this demand. It is reasonable and rational request, and it would help build public trust. I hope that he will take this opportunity in his follow-up to reassure this House that he will undertake this end-to-end review.
Secretary of State. Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions? And in the context of wanting to ensure that the victim's position is supported, I think he was right to focus on the areas that he did, and I'm grateful for him for not pressing me further on either the facts or the legal advice. In terms of the matters that he raised, it is right that the victims are treated with concern, with sympathy, and that all due processes are followed. In terms of this particular case, I think we need to have a proper understanding of precisely what happened and whether the support was provided in the way that it should have been supported, and that's why I'm pleased that Dame Glenys Stacey is undertaking that role. In terms of transparency, look, I do share the instincts of the honourable gentleman in terms of a need for greater transparency in parole board decisions. And I know that one of the things that frustrates victims is the sense that they don't get to know what is happening and the reasons why a parole board has reached the decision that it has reached. Equally, I think it can be a frustration for the parole board that they are not able to articulate the reasons that they have reached a particular decision. So I share that instinct. I think we do need to look very carefully at this, but we also need to move swiftly on this matter, and that's exactly what I intend to do. In terms of an end-to-end review, my focus has been on these issues of transparency and victim support. I think they are the immediate issues in front of us. I recognise that there is a debate about the original investigation. There is a debate about how these IPP sentences, which of course we have abolished, how they operated. But I think it is right that we focus at this particular point in terms of our reviews on transparency and the victims, and continue to look at how these matters are dealt with as a priority.
Mr. Robert Neal. It's very clear, Mr. Speaker, and may I wish you a happy birthday. But it is very clear, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, has applied himself to to what is a very serious and troubling case.
Let's leave that there from the House of Commons. You were hearing Justice Secretary David Gauke giving his statement on the handling of the John Warboys case and the parole board's decision to release him at some point, and then the response from Imran Hussain, Labour MP and Shadow Justice Minister. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is with us here in the studio. Martin, worth reminding people the background to this case and also the reasons that the Justice Secretary gave for those decisions that he's made. There will not be a judicial review, basically.
Yes, I mean, 2 weeks ago, the parole board announced that it had made a decision to release John Warboys. He was given a minimum 8-year sentence. He served 9, has served 9, and so had done his time in that sense. But the problem with this case is that he was convicted over a small number of offences, but after his conviction, the police said they felt that there were many, many other victims, but their allegations weren't pursued. So I think in the public's mind, they think John Warboys raped 102 women, but he didn't. There are police suspicions about many, many other crimes, but he was convicted on charges that were brought by 12 victims, and he's done his time. So it is a complex case, as the Justice Secretary has said. He sounded, of course, very, very supportive of a legal challenge to the parole board's decision. But, of course, he stopped short of mounting that challenge himself. And he laid it out very simply that there were 2 areas he could have challenged, but his legal advice from his own lawyers was that there wasn't a good chance of that challenge succeeding. But, of course, he did make a reference to another challenge that's underway, and 2 of Warboys' victims announced 2 days ago that they are going through the same process. They want to launch, they're going to ask for a judicial review, which would involve asking a High Court judge to look at the parole board decision and to try to get it reversed. And those 2 victims have also launched a crowdfund in which they believe the public will support them, give them lots of money to mount that challenge. And they've also asked the parole board, and we don't know the answer to this, to stay the release until that legal challenge is explored. We don't know whether there will be a judicial review, but clearly the Justice Secretary would support one, but he can't do it on his own, according to his own lawyer's advice. So we still don't know whether there will be that legal challenge. And, of course, it's only a matter of days, probably, before John Warboys is going to be released. But the Justice Secretary did say that the victims who feel they've been ignored... Consulted, weren't they? Absolutely. The conditions of the release. Yep. They will be consulted over the release conditions before he's released. And the one big thing that the victims want is for Warboys to be excluded from the Greater London area, where his crimes were committed, where many of them live. And, of course, they keep telling us he knows our addresses. They're very scared, some of them, that he might come and try to contact them. OK, Martin, for now, thank you.
Well, let's go live to Westminster and get the political reaction on this with Sky's Jason Farron. Jason, the Justice Secretary there acknowledging that this decision is going to disappoint not just the victims, but indeed many of the MPs as well.
Yeah, and many of the government's own backbench MPs. Only yesterday, Zach Goldsmith brought this up in Prime Minister's Questions, the Conservative MP, challenging the Prime Minister, saying there needed to be a judicial review, saying that the parole board decision was an insult to the victims, questioning why John Warboys was refused access to an open prison only a year or so ago and remained in a Category A prison because he was deemed not safe enough to move to an open prison, and then is seemingly allowed by the parole board to walk free, albeit having served 9 years as opposed to 8, as we were just hearing there from Martin Brunt. But it was an indeterminate sentence. And actually, funnily enough, I was a crime correspondent back then and in the court when the judge passed that sentence, and remember very clearly the judge saying that John Warboys could only be released once he no longer posed a threat to women. And he also made the point that John Warboys had created a web of deceit to ensnare. He'd perfected, he said, perfected this web of deceit to ensnare young women. And I guess the public looking at this wonder if 9 years later, this very, very deceitful, multiple sex offender has turned a corner enough that he no longer poses a threat to women. So that, as well as all the other cases that potentially should have been brought against John Warboys, is the other question around this. But as we heard there from David Gauke, he's taken this legal advice, and the way in which it is framed, he would have to prove that the parole board, in his words, could would have reasonably, no one on the parole board could have reasonably taken this decision. Or either that or that there was a procedural problem. In other words, that everybody on the parole board was either being completely unreasonable or that there is some procedural problem that would have made a material difference to that decision. He didn't want to go further into the legal advice because of these other challenges that are potentially there. And I think that he has, in this instance, answered this one question around the aspect of the decision to whether or not to have a judicial review, but there are still other questions that politicians are going to have around the openness and transparency of parole board decisions going forward, and you heard that being debated in the House. And also there are questions, and it was raised by Zach Goldsmith yesterday, over whether they should reopen these cases and whether there should be a more kind of impetus towards trying to reopen these cases that weren't taken to court after John Warboys was sentenced.
Jason, thank you.
The breaking news today is that the Justice Secretary, David Gauke, has announced he is not going to pursue a legal challenge to the decision to release the rapist John Warboys on licence. The parole board announced in December that the former black cab driver would be released at the end of this month, as its panel was confident he would not reoffend. Let's listen to what Mr Gauke said in the Commons this morning.
Having taken considered and expert legal advice, I have decided that it would not be appropriate for me as Secretary of State to proceed with such a case. Honourable members will appreciate that I cannot go further and expose details of the legal advice I have been given. I know this will disappoint the victims in this case and members of this House. Given the crimes for which he has been convicted, on a personal level, candidly, I share those concerns.
That was David Gauke, the Justice Secretary. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Samford joins me now. As he said, victims will be very disappointed, as will many others. Was he right to raise the issue of a judicial review in the first place, Daniel?
Well, certainly his decision raised some eyebrows, because the idea of the Justice Secretary judicially reviewing his own parole board would be something that was highly unusual. We, of course, don't know the nature of the legal advice that David Gauke was given, but he's now made a decision not to pursue a judicial review himself. But that does not prevent any of John Warboys' victims pursuing a judicial review, and certainly we know that two of them will certainly do that. They've already gone through the process of exchanging letters with the parole board warning of their intention to launch a judicial review, and papers will be lodged on Monday for that judicial review, and there's been assurances given that John Warboys won't be released until that judicial review decision has been considered. So in the very short term, despite David Gauke's decision today, there's no prospect of John Warboys being released imminently, not least of all because David Gauke has made it clear in the Commons this morning that he will be consulting with John Warboys' victims about the conditions under which John Warboys would be released into the community, his licence conditions, that he wants to have meetings with victims about that to make sure that if he is released, if the judicial review fails, then at least the licence conditions match some of John Warboys' victims' expectations about where he may be allowed to live and where he may not be allowed to go and what he may not be allowed to do while on licence.
Now, the focus has been on the parole board's decision. We don't know, of course, the reasons behind the decision that they took. And the head of that board said that he regarded the independence of the parole board as being extremely important. So what do you make of David Gauke's announcement in the Commons to review the transparency of the parole board?
Well, I think that sounds to be as if it's going to be broadly welcomed on all sides, not least of all by Nick Hardwick, who leads the parole board. He himself has said that he would like there to be more transparency. He'd like to be able to give some reasons in some cases for their decisions. What David Gauke has padded out today is his intention not just to review whether or not the parole board should give reasons for its decisions, but whether there should be some more transparency around the whole process, and of course that key bit about making sure that victims are informed about decisions, which wasn't the case in this case for some of John Warboys' victims. I should say that one of the controversial things about John Warboys is that he's managed to change his name to John Radford. He's been living in closed conditions in Wakefield Prison, where he is still now, and he's not been even in open conditions prior to this decision to release him out into the community.
Daniel Sanford, thank you. Well, I'm joined here in the studio by the chairman of the Justice Select Committee, Conservative MP Bob Neal. Welcome to the Daily Politics. So David Gauke's not seeking a judicial review into the decision to release John Warboys. Should he have floated the idea in the first place?
Well, yes, I think he had to. And in fairness, I was in the Commons chamber for the statement, which I think he handled with actually very great care and precision. And the reason's this. I think because of the public concern about the matter, it was legitimate for him as Justice Secretary to say, I will explore every possible avenue to see if there is a legitimate grounds for review. That's perfectly normal in many cases.
It's quite unusual for the Justice Secretary, isn't it, to take their own parole board or look at the idea of reviewing the parole board's decision, and now having to say that he's not going to go ahead because he's obviously been told there wouldn't be a high chance of success. He's raised a lot of people's expectations.
Well, actually, I think he's shown that he's applied the correct test, as any proper lawyer should. That's to say, to consider if there is an option, then get proper legal advice and act upon it. So I don't think he can be faulted in that regard.
Has John Warboys, in your mind, served long enough in prison for his crimes?
My personal view will be probably not, but I do not have the material which the parole board had, and neither do I have the reasoning for their decision. And actually what I think is important is that David Gauke is widening that review specifically to include the opportunity to change the rules so that decisions are given. And as your piece rightly said, Nick Hardwick himself is on record as saying that he would welcome that. So I think that's an area that we should be pushing for very quickly.
Although, would it not expose the parole board and its members to pressure from the public or a social media campaign or politicians in making a different decision?
Well, there's always that trade-off, isn't there, between the public interest and that turning in to an improper measure, degree of pressure. That's why Nick Warboys is right to say he himself wants more transparency. He will welcome the opportunity to explain decisions more whilst maintaining independence. Other jurisdictions do manage to get that balance, Joe, so we can learn from elsewhere.
Do you welcome the decision not to push for a judicial review of a man who has been a serial sex attacker and is going to be released, basically, after serving less than 10 years, Kate?
I fear that it would heighten the expectations, particularly of the victims, if they don't think that they have reason or cause or evidence to do this. Then they really shouldn't. We're so used to trial by media these days and trial by Twitter, we forget that there is a justice system and we don't have all the information available. My biggest concern in this case is that it's been spread to people that, you know, he has allegedly raped hundreds of women. That might be true, but there were only 12 accusations put against him in court, and we have not managed expectations as to what the result was going to be. We need to believe women more when they come forward. We need to do more to get the evidence to lock people up for longer. But in this particular case, we can't play the justice system as individuals.
How much blame needs to be put at the doors of the prosecution service at the time? Because it was their decision, or the decision was made, not to prosecute or take more cases to trial than the 14 that ended up in court.
Well, I mean, that is absolutely legitimate question. That should be asked. What I get a little uncomfortable with is politicians getting a bit too close to these kind of criminal processes. And in terms of the review, it's certainly the case that should have been looked at. You've got to question whether it should have been flagged up as clearly beforehand. It would have been perhaps more sensible to make a statement having seen the legal advice and said, I've looked at these options and taken it. But there are different ways to handle something as sensitive as this.
I mean, is John Warboys, do you think, safe in your mind to be released?
Well, I don't think we're able, any of us, to say that, because we do not have the material before us which the parole board had. I think most of us would say it was a surprising decision, given the fact that he'd been in closed conditions up until now. But I think the very important point is this, that the parole board could only deal with him for those matters for which he had been convicted, as could the original judge. And that's an issue which does have to be considered. Equally, when those prosecution decisions are taken, that does have to be done independently of political pressure, and it has to meet both what's called an evidential test, is there enough evidence to prove the offence, and secondly, a public interest test. Now, We don't know what was decided and why at those circumstances, but it's always possible, of course, that if further victims were to come forward and the evidence was credible and compelling and met the evidential test, then there is no time limit on the bringing of prosecutions for offences of this kind. But I think you're right, we have to be very calm about it. I think David Gauke was right to say, look, we will look at all avenues, but equally, having had the legal advice, then I think, no doubt, perhaps informed by that and by the factual material he had then to expand his inquiry. The position of the evidence relating to other individuals depends on each individual case.
Bob Neal, thank you. Let's move on to the decision by your government's Justice Secretary David Gauke not to seek a judicial review into the decision to release John Warboys, the black cab rapist, I should say. Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I can understand the frustration. I imagine that Mr Gauke's taken legal advice and it's probably not correct for the government to take this action. Whether his representative of his many victims wish to do so, I think was probably a different matter. I can absolutely understand the frustration of his many victims that they'll feel that justice has not been done, he hasn't served long enough. But as I think some of your earlier contributors said, the main problem was that he was only prosecuted for 14 cases at the time when he could have been many tens of more than that. And so the parole board have treated him, and indeed the courts have treated him, giving him a sentence that relates to the crimes to which he was prosecuted. That will not feel like justice to the tens and tens of his victims.
Right. Do you think he should have raised the idea at all, David Gauke, until he'd had that legal advice?
He may have raised expectations of the victims, but at the end of the day, if there is a judicial review, and I think the crowdfunding will deliver that for the victims, the objective can be achieved. And as Bob Neal said not long ago, there's an opportunity for other cases where there's compelling evidence that he possibly could be retried for cases which he wasn't originally indicted.
Thank you very much for joining us, Andrew Bridgen. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, who is in Central Lobby. Diane Abbott, your response to David Gauke's decision?
I haven't seen the legal advice that David Gauke has received. What I do say is I support the victims' wish to procure a judicial review. And I think it's just a shame that they're having to crowdfund to pay for it. Surely they should have support anyway. But I wouldn't want to comment on David Gauke's decision because I don't know what legal advice he received.
No, and
what we are calling for is an end-to-end review of the whole process and more transparency with parole board decision making.
Right, so you support his extension to have a look at the parole board's decisions and how they are made. But much has been made of the fact that the prosecution at the time was bungled. How much blame do you put on the prosecution service at the time for only bringing 14 cases to court, one for rape, when 102 women made allegations against John Warboys and many victims were just told, oh, he'll be inside for life, don't worry?
I think we have to look forward. We have to understand how wrong it is that the victims have to crowdfund to pursue a judicial review, and we have to have more transparency around parole board decision making.
Do you also think the police and prosecution service have to listen to victims more, because then more cases would have been brought forward and then the judge would have given a longer sentence perhaps, and the parole board would not have had the discussion to release him in under 10 years?
We don't know the detail of what happened when the decision was taken to prosecute Warboy for what was a relatively small number of offences. So it would be unwise to make statements about that. But more generally, it seems to me that the police and the prosecution authorities need more resources to enable them to take a really thorough approach to cases like these.
But isn't it that decision that has actually landed the parole board and the government in the situation it is today?
What I would say is they need, the police and the prosecuting authorities need the resources to have a really thorough look at cases like these in the future.
Diana, but we wanted to talk to you also about child refugees and migrants. We've seen the footage of the camps in Calais, but why should Britain take in more unaccompanied minors? As Andrew Bridgen said, isn't it just fuelling the incentive for more children to make that dangerous journey?
You've seen the footage. I've actually visited the refugee camps in Calais, and I can't overstate the horror of the conditions. I know the jungle, so-called jungle, was cleared, but now hundreds more have come back in horrific conditions. And we have a moral responsibility to child refugees. And if this agreement between Macron and Theresa May means that both sides are stepping up to their responsibilities to refugees, then that's obviously a good thing.
I mean, the British Red Cross say 220 child migrants have arrived in the UK so far because of the Alf Dubs Amendment, Labour Lord. Now, the government ended that last year and set a limit of 480 children. Is that, in your mind, an arbitrary figure? Should the cap be lifted?
It's a completely arbitrary figure. The number of child refugees that we take should be determined by need, not by an arbitrary figure. There are local authorities who are willing to take these children. It's extraordinary to me that people should be arguing the toss about saving children from the awful conditions around Calais at the present time.
Right, so you think it should be whatever, I mean, there shouldn't be a limit at all. We could take thousands if that is the need.
I believe it's about need. I believe we can't have an arbitrary cap, but I also believe that both sides have to step up to their responsibilities. One of the problems on the French side has been it takes an inordinately long length of time to apply for refugee status if you're in France. And the voluntary organisations dealing with this issue believe the French themselves could do more. But no, I won't set an arbitrary limit on the number of desperate children we welcome to this country.
Just stay with us for a moment while I turn to my guests. Kate Andrews, do you think it should be, as Diane described, a case of taking in unaccompanied child refugees on a basis of need, no limit?
We have to be realistic about what we actually have the resources for. If you bring in thousands upon thousands of people and you literally can't help them because you don't have the resources, it's hard to see how that would benefit. But I do agree with Diane Abbott that the number we're taking in currently is too low. We are talking about children. We are not talking about economic migrants here. Andrew's point about being more transparent with the public about how they're being vetted and what age they are is well taken. That has to be made very, very clear. But especially post-Brexit, if Britain wants to maintain its status in the world, it needs to step up to its moral duty of helping those who are most vulnerable.
Do you think, when it came to the meeting yesterday, that Emmanuel Macron, to some extent, has the whip hand in dictating terms on things like paying for officials over in France and also Britain, in his mind, doing more to take in unaccompanied children?
I mean, the interesting thing is he actually retreated a bit from his harder position before the election campaign in France, where he wanted to rip up Le Touquet entirely. And he's taken a bit of stick in France for not getting enough from the UK, not enough money, not enough commitment on the refugee side. So I think that there's probably quite an interest on the UK side to ensure that level of engagement in taking on the UK's responsibilities is there to protect this agreement, because if the debate starts in France about why is the border in France rather than in the UK, that might be quite difficult to contain.
I mean, Diana, but do you believe that freedom of movement needs to continue even after we leave the EU? And what checks, if any, then, should there be on those coming in?
The government has agreed with our position that there has to be a transitional period when we leave the EU, and as part of that transitional period we will stay within the single market and the customs union. If we're in the single market, there will be a measure of freedom of movement. But I return to the argument that we should be taking more of these child refugees, and there can't be thousands of them because there aren't thousands of people around Calais, and I just think that's a way of ducking our moral responsibilities.
Diane Abbott, thank you very much.
There will be no government challenge to the decision to release the serial sex attacker John Warboys. The former black cab driver was jailed in 2009 for attacking 12 women, but it's suspected he assaulted and raped many more. The Justice Secretary, David Gauke, admitted he shares the concerns of Warboys victims, but that it would not be appropriate to seek judicial review of the parole board's ruling to free him. Two of his victims are mounting their own challenge to try to keep Warboys behind bars. June Kelly has more.
He is one of the country's most notorious serial sex offenders. In his black cab, John Warboys cruised for victims, not fares. He was convicted of drugging and sexually assaulting 12 women. One of them he raped. But it's feared he may have attacked more than 100 in total. The decision to release him after less than a decade in prison provoked astonishment, including at the top of government. At the start of this week, it emerged that the Justice Secretary was looking to challenge the decision in the courts. As the week draws to a close, he announced that after taking legal advice, he won't be going down that route. But he tried to offer reassurance to Warboys victims.
Let me be absolutely clear. Warboys will not be released until their representations have been properly considered and his licence conditions are in place. Indeed, last week, I asked for assurances that the views of victims were being taken into account and that robust licensing conditions would be put in place to manage his risk.
But as one politician withdraws from the court arena, another, Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, says he's now investigating whether he can bring a legal challenge. Warboys is currently being held at Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire. A lawyer for some of his victims is questioning why he's being freed from what is a top security jail. And in a letter to the parole board which has approved his release, there's detail on why they're pressing ahead with the victims' legal challenge to try to keep Warboys behind bars.
We presently don't know the reasons why he's been granted release, but what we do know is the nature and scope and extent of his offending. We know that up until very recently he was denying responsibility for the offence. He may still be. We know that the parole board only the previous year refused to move him to open prison because they considered he was still a risk. What has changed over that time?
The women who John Warboys picked up and then drugged and assaulted have spoken of how they fear for their safety if he's freed. They say he knows their addresses, and they're calling for him to be banned from the entire Greater London area. His victims are set to launch their legal challenge next week. And while that's going on, the black cab rapist, as he's known, will remain in prison. June Kelly, BBC News.
Well, our legal correspondent Clive Coleman is with me here. So, Clive, now the government's accepted that it cannot stop Warboys being released from prison, is there any realistic challenge that his victims can stop him getting out?
Well, two of his victims are going to try and attempt a judicial review. We should remember that a judicial review isn't an appeal of whether a decision is right or wrong. It's simply a review of whether the process of making the decision was lawful or not. And if a court finds that the process was unlawful, they can send the decision back, in this case, to the parole board to go through it all over again. Now, it's unprecedented for victims to try and judicially review the parole board. They'll now have to lodge an urgent application seeking permission. It's a two-stage process. Warboys doesn't have to appear at that. A judge will then consider the grounds, and if permission to give a judicial review is granted, then there will be an injunction to stop John Warboys' release at that stage. Now, there'll then be a full ruling, a full hearing. That is some weeks away, and it's at that point that we'll get the disclosure of what this decision was actually amounted to, the detail of it. If there's medical evidence, there could be confidentiality issues. That would mean that a final hearing might not be fully public. But if the court finds that this process was unlawful, then they will send it back to the parole board. They will have to go through it all over again. So, no, this isn't over yet.
OK, Clive, thank you.
Injustice anywhere, wrote Martin Luther King, is a threat to justice everywhere. Sometimes the cry of injustice is raised by the accused, sometimes by victims. But this week, unusually, we've heard it from both sides in rape trials. For many, today's government announcement that it'll not challenge the parole board's decision to free the black cab rapist John Warboys is inexplicable. Lawyers for two of Warboys' victims have said they instead will take up the legal battle. And around the same time that the government abandoned its Warboys challenge, prosecutors in Guildford formally dropped their case against a man accused of rape. Oliver Mears became the 4th man in 4 weeks to have long-standing charges against him dropped shortly before trial because of the discovery late on of information suggesting his innocence. We'll hear from the Director of Public Prosecutions in a moment, asking whether her service, far from defending the interests of victims and accused alike, is actually failing both. But first, here's Chris Cook.
Concern about the police and Crown Prosecution Service's handling of rape charges has been mounting on several fronts lately. A month ago, the Metropolitan Police said they were reviewing 30 rape trials that were about to start. We don't know what they've concluded, but we know this. This week, 19-year-old Oliver Mears learned that a case against him had been dropped after new evidence, a diary, was unearthed. By now, he's already spent 2 years on bail. Earlier this week, another case against another man collapsed after photographs were found on a phone that undermined the prosecution case. Pictures only found by an expert, hide by the defence. In December, a case of sexual activity against a child was dropped after texts showed that the alleged victim routinely lied about her age, evidence not made available to the defence in good time. And here is Liam Allen. In his case, the police failed to disclose text messages which cast doubt on rape allegations made against him.
In the last 2 years, I've just spent worrying and you know, not really concentrated on anything. And so it has completely ripped apart my normal sort of personal life.
In 2010-11, there were 4,200 prosecutions for rape. Of these, about 2,500 led to convictions. Since then, the number of prosecutions has risen to roughly 5,200 a year. That's led to around 3,000 convictions. The share of prosecutions leading to convictions has not substantially changed over this period, even as the volumes have risen. But prosecutions have also not kept up with the rising rate at which the crime is being reported. In 2015-16, the police recorded 24,000 complaints of rape. While all that's going on, there's also a question for the CPS around the release of John Warboys, the so-called black cab rapist, by the parole board. Today we learned his release would not be challenged by the government, although victims are bringing a judicial review.
Having taken considered and expert legal advice, I have decided that it would not be appropriate for me as Secretary of State to proceed with such a case. Honourable members will appreciate that I cannot go further and expose details of the legal advice I have been given. I know this will disappoint the victims in this case and members of this House. Given the crimes for which he has been convicted, on a personal level, candidly, I share those concerns.
Warboys was only tried for a small number of the offences for which he is a suspect. Had he been convicted on further counts, whether as part of that first trial or since, he could have been imprisoned for longer, and further evidence could have been deployed against him before the parole board, which released him. The challenge for the CPS is whether they should have tried to mount more prosecutions against Warboys. All in all, a lot of questions to answer.
Chris Cook there. Well, Alison Saunders is the Director of Public Prosecutions. I spoke to her earlier today and started by asking her why the Oliver Mears case had collapsed.
It wasn't a disclosure as in late disclosure of material, but it was about looking at the case again, reviewing it, as we have a constant duty to do, actually review cases and make sure that they still satisfy the code for Crown prosecutors. But there was some late material that came through, and when we looked at everything again, decided that it was not sufficient evidence to prosecute. What should have happened in that case, of course, was that it all should have happened much earlier, and I quite understand and I can imagine how distressing it must be for everybody involved, all of the parties. Absolutely. And that shouldn't have happened, and that's what we are looking at, how we make sure that disclosure, which hasn't been going right across the whole system, how that really should happen much earlier in the proceedings.
In terms of what happened in the Mears case, when you said that information arose at a certain point later on, was that during that 2 years we're talking about? Was it at some point, or was it late on in the original investigation?
Some information came to us very late in the day, as in only just before we made the decision to stop the case. What should have happened is that all should have happened much earlier. So, and for that I can only apologise to all who were involved in the case, because we should have made sure that we had done that earlier and taken those decisions earlier to stop the case.
Is it essentially, in your view, a resource issue?
I don't think it's just a resource issue. I think there are real issues for all of us to think about. How do we obtain or how do we deal with this new issue? We all wander around with phones or tablets or some sort of device. We live our lives on these things now, and they're often as big as computers. So it's about how do we possibly look through, or how do the police look through all of that? How do we find that needle in a sort of huge data haystack? And how do we know that it's relevant? And also, if it's your telephone or your tablet, do you want people going through your whole life when actually some of it is not relevant and is never going to be relevant?
You've said resources aren't the only issue, clearly, but are you concerned that the police don't actually have the resources to go through phones and social media material in the quantities they would have to give both sides in a case like this a fair trial?
I certainly think if it was a blanket, you have to look at all this material, we wouldn't have the resources and cases wouldn't be brought before the courts because it would just drown us in material, which is where we have to try and balance what we can do with really making sure that there is a fair trial. So which is why it's that targeted aspect to look at what's relevant and making sure that when we get what's relevant, we disclose that and let the defence and the court know what we are doing and why, so they can question it if they think we have missed something or if they know something that we don't.
Now, clearly what you're trying to do in these cases is look at the rights of the accused, but we've also, of course, in the news got a very different equation with the rights of victims, in the Warboys case, for example. Hearing what the Justice Secretary said today, I know you don't run the parole board, you look at it as a sort of informed observer, but do you understand why they won't give their reasons in a case like the Warboys?
As far as the parole board is concerned, it is outside my authority. I don't oversee it. I don't understand exactly why the decisions are not transparent, and that's a matter for the government, and obviously the Lord Chancellor has said he's going to look into that.
One of the things I think that is hard for people to understand about the Warboys case is why only such a small proportion of the original victims saw their cases coming into court. Do you think more of them should have been prosecuted, more of those cases?
We've looked back over the decision and we had somewhere in the region of 83 individual complainants referred to us. We prosecuted 14 of those 83 that were originally referred to us. We couldn't prosecute the rest because there wasn't sufficient evidence. So it didn't satisfy the code for Crown prosecutors, where we have to have a realistic prospect of conviction. So we couldn't do that. There were 3 cases which were referred whilst we were in trial, which we didn't prosecute for public interest grounds because we felt it wasn't going to add to the sentence and it may complicate the case that was already before the court. So I think we made the right decisions from the evidence that we had at that time and having looked at the review decision.
Is there any way that either those 3 or cases that might even emerge subsequently could still be put forward for prosecution?
I mean, we have certainly said that we will review any cases that the police may want to refer to us, and indeed we're talking to the police about if there is any action that can be taken or giving them advice if they're asking for it. So if we get anything new or we look at it again, or we're asked to look at it again, we will look at it in accordance with the code.
But just to be clear, you're saying that is an ongoing conversation with the police in this case, is it?
It is an ongoing conversation, but of course, if we've decided there wasn't sufficient evidence, we've got to have evidence to take before the court, so there will have to be something new.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the Director of Public Prosecutions.